I find this very sad, by the way. It troubles me, not obviously because I was once part of all this, but also just as an American citizen, to realize that this country is indulging in activities that are just as cruel and just as depraved in some cases, and almost as extensive as what, for example, the Gestapo indulged in Germany. We haven't liquidated 5 million Jews, but 800,000 minimum figure people killed in terrorist circumstances in the Third World is a lot of people dead. And the responsibility, ultimately, yes, it's done by the CIA and it's a secret organization, and therefore we have plausible denial to our own consciences, because there's nothing we can do about it, we don't know about it, and they didn't consult us. But the other side of that coin is that the CIA is the United States police organ, and what it does, we, the American people, are responsible for. So that in addition to the personal losses of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, we are responsible for the genocide of terrorism that's taking place against the world today in our name and with our tax dollars.
And with the changes of the laws and executive orders, the whole apparatus of the intelligence services, including the FBI and their right-wing hit squad buddies like the Nazis and the Klan, are now being able to be turned on the American people.
Turned on the American people.
With impunity.
Remember that, Lou Wolf mentioning the executive order, which we've all followed with great interest. That, too, is President Reagan going public, bragging about what he's doing with the CIA. But don't forget that the CIA has always functioned extensively inside the United States. The MK a billion-dollar program, was all domestic. MK Ultra experimentation on American citizens with drugs and LSD and whatnot. That went on for 20 years, and that was inside the United States on American guinea pigs. The opening of mail for 20 years was American citizens' mail. They've always done this thing. The Operation Mongoose war against Cuba was run from Florida, and they had over 1,000 safe houses and boat docks and whatnot that they were operating from the United States. The training facilities for torture, for interrogation techniques, were in San Antonio, Texas at one time, a few years back. And, that's something that's easy to move somewhere else. I don't know where it is today.
John, recently one of the individuals in the CIA that was in charge of these covert operations has recently resigned, and that is Admiral Bobby Inman, who was allegedly second in command at the CIA. It's been widely reported that Inman himself believed that William Casey, who is the director of the CIA, was overly fond of, quote, adventurous but ill-advised CIA operations abroad. And Senator Joseph Biden of Delaware has recently noted, without Inman, the intelligence agencies may be given license to try all kinds of questionable things here and abroad. In the light of what they've been doing, even under Inman already, what would be your comments on the Inman resignation and the future of the CIA?
Well, I would have to regret the fact that he left. Not that he was a paragon of liberal virtue, but he seemed to be, when compared with William Casey and some of the others, Jesse Helms over on the Senate side, Carlucci, his predecessor, he seemed to have some pretty strong instincts for protecting American institutions. He protested the Names of Agents bill at one time, or at least one version of it, as being unessential to American national security, and of course he got a lot of criticism for that. It would seem that he was, in effect, a moderating influence on some of the crueler instincts of men like Casey, who of course is a very inept and corrupt individual. The corruption being that he's maintained his own business portfolio. He's a millionaire. While he's CIA director, he's running the CIA, he's running his own businesses, and of course from the CIA he can have some influence on world economic matters. He has also been appearing at Republican fundraisers, and of course that's one of the biggest no-nos in the United States governmental system, to have the head of a police organization with the influence of the CIA to openly advocate one political party's position and help it raise money. In that kind of a corrupt, adventuresome atmosphere, one would have to regret Inman's resignation. The whole milieu, the environment is favorable to Reagan and the CIA and what they want to accomplish, what they are accomplishing. If you go one step further and consider Reagan's policies his first year in office, he's muted this a little bit, faced with a clear indication by the American populace, about war. He and Attila the Hague were speaking constantly about the viability of nuclear war. War was an effective tool. We shouldn't be afraid of war. Going to war in El Salvador, discussing sending troops into Nicaragua, talking frequently about going to the source, quote, in Cuba, and talking about, demonstration wars or limited wars, nuclear wars in Europe and whatnot. These people gave every indication that they were looking for war. Now, they have toned this down a little bit in the last 2 months. First, you saw the turn, we all saw the turn, everybody who reads the newspapers, when the polls responded. 89% of the American people said they did not favor American military intervention in Nicaragua. And this was a pretty clear indication to the president that the American people were not going to support him. He would not be a successful president if he got us into a war. It would be something that he would have trouble selling, trouble maintaining. At the same time, there was a move in Congress that if the government of El Salvador didn't modify its human rights positions, they wouldn't get more money for aid. And then the second thing, of course, has been this massive groundswell reaction to his attitudes towards the bomb. And that's national, every corner of the nation, little bitty towns across the nation organizing effectively and having big demonstrations, as well as the big cities. The nation and the world so deeply concerned about the threat of nuclear war and just absolutely horrified that you could possibly have a president in office whose mental capacities were so limited that he would actually talk publicly of demonstration atom bombs in Europe, popping off a bomb to show our will and resolve, limiting nuclear war to Europe, and the possibility of surviving nuclear war in the United States. This has horrified people to the point where he's got a big political problem on his hand from the famous Ground Zero and the freeze. And the result is that it's forcing a change in their stated policies and attitudes. They're toning down quite a bit from what they were saying a year ago at this time, for example, responding to the mood of the nation in some frustration, I think, clearly.
Well, thank you, John.
That's fine. We've exhausted you again, but we appreciate it.
Now news stories from 3 different years. First, May of 1982.
So we started our 3-part investigation of CIA covert action with a program with John Stockwell and Louis Wolf that talked about the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, and they did a criticism of it, of how it would subvert American civil liberties, freedom of speech, and our democracy. Well, since then, we found out in an article in The Progressive that Uncle Walter Cronkite, has joined John Stockwell and others in criticizing the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. The Progressive reports that Walter was talking in Dallas to the National Associations of Broadcasters Convention, and he attacked the Reagan administration's pattern of restriction on press freedom. He deplored administration support for Supreme Court rulings that permit police to raid newsrooms in search of sources and that compel journalists to disclose sources in court. He also lamented the administration decision to limit the Freedom of Information Act and the Reagan policy of no longer declassifying government documents automatically after 30 years. Walter scorned a plan to protect business information that would keep investigative stories and commentary on topics ranging from pollution threats to dangerous drugs at a serious disadvantage, and he called the free press's democracy the only fail-safe system against both the dangers of its own excesses and the approach of tyranny. While I'm citing stories from the Progressive, I might also note that in the page after the story on Walter Cronkite, there's a story datelined Austin, Texas, with a headline, and that's the way it really is. The article begins, "The ever-shriveling scope, the triumph of technique over content, and the cheerful rush to insipidity among anchors on network news are familiar aspects of television news. From the happy talk and video gimmicks of local newscasts to the corporate paranoia of the networks, television's current events reporting has become almost dysfunctional. Viewers know this, hence the deep-seated distrust of the broadcast media. But the oligarchic nature of the television industry has blocked alternatives up until now, leaving most Americans reliant on the lighted box as their primary source of information. At last, this stranglehold may be broken," the article reads.
And by whom?
And by whom?
We cry.
For the past 3 years, we learn, a weekly news documentary program, Alternative Views, produced in Austin and broadcast over the public access channel provided by the local cable franchise, has been doing what others do not. It has been presenting very unslick, intense, hour-long documentaries and interviews with the likes of Ramsey Clark, Russell Means, Stokely Carmichael, Madeleine Murray O'Hare, John Henry Falk, George Wald, John Henry Falk, Helen Caldecott, William Kunstler, Daniel Ellsberg, and John Stockwell. And then the article goes on to describe our program, the format, and what we're trying to accomplish. So we thank the Progressive for publishing this, and we'll pat ourselves on the back.
Well, mean unslick. Hey,
Really, I always thought we were pretty slick here. Trust us.
Well, I would assume by now that you've heard about that famous remark by Thomas K. Jones, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Nuclear Theater Forces, or Strategic Theater Nuclear Forces. That's part of our unslickness there. He says, hey, don't worry about nuclear war. Everybody's going to make it if you got enough dirt. If there are enough shovels to go around, you need those two things. Dig a hole, cover it up with a couple of doors, throw 3 feet of dirt on top, and you're safe from a nuclear holocaust, folks. Well, even to top that, that was just plain stupid, but in Insensibility, the Department of Energy study recommended that after a nuclear attack, people over 40 years of age should be the first to leave their bomb shelters. Hell with that. These post-attack pioneers would search for food and clean up a bit, you know, for the younger survivors, because, they say, older people have a shorter life expectancy anyway, and the study reasoned that near-lethal doses of radiation would make much difference anyway. By the time they caught anything, they'd already be dead. And also, they wouldn't pass on any radiation-induced genetic defects to future generations. Well, I don't know about that. Anyway, they asked Grey Panther President Maggie Kuhn what she thought about that. She told him.
I'm right behind you, Frank.
Yeah, well, 39. But something is being done about it. The City Council in Cambridge, Massachusetts, determined that they, instead of having a cooperation day for evacuation with the civil defense folks, they would have a preventive evacuation day by urging their citizens to join in the mass rally for disarmament in New York City on June the 12th. A lot of people are going to that.
Do y'all like fairy tales? Well, there's a dandy one every week in Sunday's Parade magazine if you're into real fantasy. I'm talking, of course, about your basic free enterprise message from the ever-loving people at Mobil Oil, part of their multi-million-dollar-a-year PR package. I'm sure you've all seen this. It's called Observations, and they've always got this little cartoon in here that's never funny, in case you've all noticed before. Well, this whole thing is designed to show America once and for all who are the good guys and who are the bad. A big is beautiful campaign, you might say. We're seeing a lot of this kind of thing on TV now, too. The whitewater canoeist experiencing the thrill of victory while simultaneously clearing the good name of Getty Oil. Those cute little oil wells aswarm with 59 different endangered species of birds and bugs. The industrious cartoon pie maker who has the world beating a path to his door to bid on his pies. They all strain to make that one meaningful statement. Hell, we just plain old folk like you. Well, is anybody listening? Personally, I'm underwhelmed at their sincerity. and a tad put off by the political motif of stuff like this. You think Reagan's a supply sider? This column makes him sound like Karl Marx or Freddie Engels. This particular one was exemplary. It made a monumental leap of reasoning across 2 centuries to assert that George Washington's troops almost starved to death at Valley Forge because of price controls. We'll all be. I didn't know that. After a quick razzle-dazzle with oil production figures and constant 1980 dollars, the text then leads you to the inescapable conclusion that it would be silly to put price controls on natural gas. I mean, we wouldn't want the troops to starve. All those poor old oil barons down gutting it out in the trenches with the dirt, the vermin, the spilled Perrier. I may just be paranoid, but whenever corporations start billing their programs and ideas as a boon to all mankind, I think it's time to hide the silverware. And I still can't help but feel a little bit guilty when we fund the torture of peasants so that United Fruit can bring the world to us packed in a light syrup.
From May of 1982, we now switch to May of 1983.
According to the Wall Street Journal, Mr. Reagan's Energy Department has been busily doling out more of that welfare for the rich oil companies in this case. The General Accounting Office, which is a congressional watchdog agency, says that the department is making settlements with oil moguls that are unduly favorable to the industry. So what's new? The GAO charges that the Reagan team is letting some of the major oil companies off the hook to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. Shell Oil, U.S. Steel's Marathon Oil, Mobil Oil Company, and several others were nailed for overcharging customers prior to the decontrol of oil in 1981. Now, you may have seen the 60 Minutes segment that dealt with how new oil miraculously became old oil with its higher price tag and all that rot. Well, now comes payback time, and suddenly the Reagan gang is getting generous again with our money. The administration's top official in the department, Rayburn Hanslick, says the new settlements are based on, quote, more accurate and more realistic cost figures than they ever had before. I guess somebody boogered up a neater set of books for the department this time. Shell Oil, for one, will save a pretty penny because of this. Company officials had originally bargained with the Carter administration to settle an alleged $151 million in overcharges. The Carter people said, ante up $75 million, we'll call it square. Well, now Mr. Reagan's department says that $50 million is quite enough, thank you. Marathon Oil overcharged customers some $41 million, according to government investigators. Mr. Hanslick and the boys in the back room will settle for $11 million. The topper is a deal they cut with Mobil. Overall, Mobil may have ripped off buyers for more than $900 million in various cost violations. Our benevolent energy department says $29 million will cover it. Or cover it up might be a better way to put it. Well, because of the hubbub surrounding these sweet deals, the department has delayed signing some of the agreements and others pending with Gulf Oil and Cities Service, which was just recently swallowed up by Occidental Petroleum. The Wall Street noted also that the Reagan team has not shown any great enthusiasm at all for pursuing this type of enforcement. In fact, the administration budget for 1984 proposed cutting their allotment from $21 million down to $7 million. They don't want them nosing around too much. But why would they want to bite the hand that feeds them? For my own part, I'm not particularly surprised by this whole affair. Once a week, it seems, the business press carries something or other like this. It's blatant stuff, and it's pretty old hat. What really amazes me is that so much energy is devoted to railing against pissant things such as unreported busboy and waitress tips, Social Security overpayments where Gramps has gotten a part-time job selling candles, and food stamp abuse. These damn people are eating. And all the while, it's business as usual in the counting house. You know, I've just about decided to become a finance baron so I can live outside of the law, too.
Say, Craig, I found an old statistic which I used about a few years ago, but it bears on what you were saying a while ago. When the price of gasoline at the pump is raised 1 penny around the country, Do you know how much wealth goes from us to them? You have any idea?
It's got to be astounding. More than $5.
It's $2.9 million a day.
A day.
A day.
In pennies.
So you can imagine how much is going back to the oil companies after the oil glut brought the price down, and then the government put on that, what, 5 cents?
5 cents a gallon.
5 cents, but they raised it much higher than 5 cents.
Seemed to go up about 10
about 17 cents, anywhere between 10 and 17 cents. They raised it above that. So you can figure out that additional above the tax and figure out from 2.9 million a day, take that over a year. I'm no good at math, but that's
a lot of money.
A lot of money.
In May of 1983, the Congress went along with Reagan's crazed plan to produce the MX missile, and it looks like money is being freed to continue the MX missile program, even though it appeared that it was going to be defeated. However, there's an article in these Times that indicates that it's going to be a little bit difficult to base these MX missiles anywhere in the country because of the public opposition to the missile, the grassroots opposition that's arising. When Carter was talking about his racetrack concept to have the MX missiles on this racetrack that would be put in Nevada or Utah, the citizens of that state organized and put tremendous pressure on the governor, the state legislature, to try to make it not be the case that these missiles be put in Nevada and Utah, so that suddenly this program was abandoned by the federal government. Then they started talking about Montana and Wyoming as a good place to put the dense pack MX missiles. Well, there was a lot of opposition that has already arisen in Montana. The governor came out against it, and 8 of the 9 congressional representatives, as well as grassroots groups throughout Montana. However, Wyoming, the governor and some of the Congress people there seems to be a little friendlier to the MX, and they have invited the Air Force to come and check out the state and said they would cooperate with them as an MX missile site. However, a grassroots opposition group in Wyoming is now starting to form called Western Solidarity. Some of the same people that organized opposition to the MX in these other states are going to Wyoming to help them organize. They're planning a big rally in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and more groups and individuals are becoming aware of the dangers to their ecology and, of course, to their very survival if there was ever a nuclear war. So grassroots opposition to the MX missile program is growing significantly in Wyoming itself. Therefore, if the Reagan administration attempts to try to base these MX missiles anywhere in the southwest or the northwest, they're going to get grassroots opposition from a new group called Western Solidarity that's organized throughout this region, consisting of ranchers, of church groups, of environmentalists, of public citizens, all of whom are opposed to the MX missile, including now a group in Wyoming.
We've had stories from 1982 and 83, and now May 1985.
Probably Ronald Reagan's greatest political and public relations blunder was his visit to Bitburg, Germany, to the cemetery where SS troopers were buried along with other German and American soldiers. You also might wonder why Reagan originally didn't agree to go to a concentration camp and to a commemoration service for the dead Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. Well, the New York Times reported that Nancy Reagan put a zap on that she thought that Holocaust and concentration camps were sort of a downer and too depressing, and she thought that Reagan should project a more positive, happy, cheerful image, so she vetoed a trip to a concentration camp. However, there was such an outcry when it was revealed that there were all these SS stormtroopers buried at Bitburg that Reagan did finally agree to go to a concentration camp. Well, the Village Voice, the week before Reagan's visit to Germany, had an article about anti-Semitism in the Reagan administration and some very dubious attitudes of some of his officials in an article called Bitburg, Tip of the Iceberg. Reagan's communications director is Pat Buchanan, who you may have seen on the cable news network on the Firing Line show. And Buchanan, I think, was also a Spiro Agnew speechwriter and very active in the Nixon administration. Craig, you've read about Buchanan's attitude towards anti-Semitism and the Jews.
That's right. There is an office in that Congress had a hand in setting up under the aegis of the Justice Department. It's called the Office of Special Investigations, and which supposedly was set up to prosecute and deport alleged Nazi war criminals and collaborators who fraudulently entered the United States. Well, Mr. Buchanan, since he became involved with it, has not been too gung-ho about prosecuting these people. In fact, he said in a speech, he said he saw nothing singular about the Holocaust. He said, and it, quote, "just seems to me that allocating funds into running down aggressively these people is just not a proper use of resources." And like you say, he was involved with the Nixon campaign. He was a speechwriter for Mr. Nixon. And if you'll recall, if you read the Watergate tapes, the book that was made from the tapes, there were several anti-Semitic slurs on the tape from Mr. Buchanan, and it said that Mr. Buchanan was the one important White House staffer who convinced Mr. Reagan to go ahead and visit Bitburg.
The Reagan administration, in fact, Ronald Reagan himself, this time is also in trouble for writing a friendly letter to one of the most notorious anti-Semitics in the whole United States, a Dr. Roger Pearson, who's the president of a Council for Social and Economic Studies. Reagan wrote him a letter congratulating him on his journal and saying that you are performing a valuable service in bringing to a wide audience the work of leading scholars who are supportive of a free enterprise economy, a firm and consistent foreign policy, and a strong national defense. However, Mr. Pearson has also been active in anti-Semitic circles for many decades. In Britain, in 1956, he started publishing a racist journal called Northern World, whose purpose was to make whites aware of their forgotten racial heritage and to cut through the Judaic fog of lies about our origin and the accomplishment of our race and Western culture. In 1958, Mr. Pearson founded a Northern League in Britain, whose purpose was to bring together the strands of post-war neo-Nazism and whose members included racial theorists who were active in the Nazi regime in Germany. Then he came to the United States in 1964 and began publishing a journal called Western Destiny, who had on its editorial board what the Village Voice described as a rogues gallery of racist and anti-Semites, Klan leaders, Holocaust debunkers, former Waffen-SS officers, British and American neo-Nazis and fascists, members of the White Citizens Council, etc. They then started publishing a journal called Mankind Quarterly that specialized in racist articles, including one that reported on a 1962 trip to South Africa that was sponsored by the apartheid government to study, quote, Bantu racial characteristics, that was illustrated by a photo of a Zulu man in profile intended to illustrate his Jewish nose. Since then, Mr. Pearson has published a whole stream of racist and anti-Semitic books, Eugenics and Race, Blood Groups and Race. He received $36,000 from the Pioneer Fund that was dedicated to scientific racism and run by political associates of Senator Jesse Helms, and more recently has been involved with the Liberty Lobby anti-Semitics and racists in publishing several anti-Semitic things. So this is a gentleman that Ronald Reagan sent a personal letter to congratulating him on the valuable service that his publishing enterprises are carrying forth. And even after the criticism was leveled against Mr. Pearson for being one of the most grotesque racists in his country, the Reagan administration refused to retract the praise in this letter and refused to criticize Mr. Pearson publicly, showing an incredible moral blindness on the part of the Reagan administration towards the issue of anti-Semitism.
It's nothing new, though.
And that's Alternative Views for this evening. We hope you enjoyed our three-part series on covert action around the world. If you have any comments to make, here's our address: Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78712. Good night.